On the morning of August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese soldiers were still prepared to die. Across the mountains of China, in the steaming jungles of Burma, on Pacific islands reduced to ash and coral, and inside barracks on the Japanese home islands, men in faded uniforms still believed the war would end only one way, with their deaths. For years they had been taught that surrender was a disgrace worse than death. Capture meant shame not only for themselves, but for their families, their ancestors, and even the emperor. Then, shortly after noon, radios crackled to life. For the first time in history, the voice of Emperor Hirohito was broadcast directly to the Japanese people. Most soldiers had never heard him speak. To them, he was not merely a monarch, he was a living descendant of the sun goddess, a sacred figure beyond human reach. And now that distant, almost fragile voice echoed through speakers in military compounds and field radios across a shattered empire. The speech, known as the Gyukuon Hoso, the jewel voice broadcast, did not contain the word surrender. Instead, it spoke in formal, archaic court language. Many soldiers could barely understand it. The emperor spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. He mentioned a new and most cruel bomb. He said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For several long seconds after the broadcast ended, there was silence. Some soldiers turned to their officers, confused. Was this a trick? Was it enemy propaganda? Had the sacred voice truly just admitted defeat? For those who understood, the psychological collapse was devastating. These were men raised under the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, a moral system that exalted loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice. Military training had reinforced the idea that to be taken prisoner was the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers carried grenades not only to throw at the enemy, but to use on themselves if capture became inevitable. Officers were expected to lead by example, even if it meant ritual suicide. Now the emperor himself had ordered them to lay down their arms. In some units, disbelief quickly turned into rage. A handful of officers refused to accept the broadcast as genuine. They insisted it had been forged by American forces. In isolated areas, commanders gathered their men and declared that the fight would continue. There were small mutinies. There were desperate plans to seize government buildings and prevent surrender from being carried out. Inside Japan, a group of radical officers even attempted a last-minute coup the night before the broadcast, hoping to prevent the recording from ever reaching the airwaves. They failed. By noon on August 15th, the emperor's voice had already crossed the nation. For frontline soldiers, especially those who had watched friends die in banzai charges or suicide attacks, the emotional collapse was immediate. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at the ground. A number of officers gathered their units one final time, bowed, and took their own lives. In documented cases, commanders committed seppuku after reading the imperial rescript aloud. In certain garrisons, soldiers followed their superiors into death, believing that obedience required them to share the same fate. In other places, men fired their weapons into the air one last time, unsure what to do next. The entire moral framework that had sustained them for years had vanished in a single broadcast. In China and Southeast Asia, confusion lasted even longer. Communications were slow, fragmented, and sometimes non-existent. Some units continued fighting for days or even weeks, either unaware of the surrender or unwilling to accept it.
Others were surrounded by enemy forces who demanded immediate capitulation. For soldiers who had been told that Americans would torture and execute them, stepping forward with raised hands felt like stepping into oblivion. The fear of capture was not imaginary. Japanese troops had witnessed brutal fighting across the Pacific. They had been instructed that surrender was shameful because the enemy would show no mercy. Many believed they would be killed on sight. Instead, in many areas, Allied forces ordered them to stack their rifles, line up, and wait. That simple act, placing a rifle on the ground, carried enormous psychological weight. It meant renouncing everything they had sworn to defend. It meant trusting an enemy they had been taught to despise. It meant accepting that the empire they had fought for no longer existed in the form they understood. For officers, the burden was even heavier. They had spent years enforcing discipline through a rigid hierarchy. Now they had to prevent panic, prevent suicide, prevent rogue attacks that could trigger retaliation. Some pleaded with their men to live, arguing that obedience to the emperor now meant survival, not death. Others could not reconcile the contradiction. In training, soldiers had memorized phrases like death before dishonor and loyalty unto death. But what happened when the emperor himself commanded them to endure defeat? Was living now the higher form of loyalty? This question tore through the ranks. In cities like Tokyo and Osaka, civilians listened to the same broadcast and wept. But for soldiers, the humiliation felt personal. They had promised victory. They had been told Japan was invincible. They had watched propaganda films celebrating heroic last stands. Now they faced not glory, but surrender. Some destroyed regimental flags rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Others burned documents and photographs. There were quiet farewells between comrades who had expected to die together in battle, not survive together in defeat. The psychological collapse of August 15th was not loud and explosive everywhere. In many places, it was quiet, a slow internal breaking. Men who survived years of combat found themselves unsure how to exist without war. The structure of command, the clarity of purpose, the absolute certainty of sacrifice, all of it dissolved. And yet, despite the suicides and scattered refusals, the vast majority obeyed. They stood down, they stacked their rifles, they waited. In that moment, more than 6 million soldiers faced a future they had never been trained to imagine. They were alive in a world where the emperor had chosen survival over annihilation. The code that had guided them demanded death, but the sovereign they worshipped demanded endurance. The war had ended not with a final charge, but with a voice, calm, distant, almost fragile, telling them to accept the unthinkable. For many Japanese soldiers, the battle for survival was over. The battle to understand what that survival meant had just begun.
In the days after August 15, 1945, the war did not simply stop. Across the ruins of Japan's empire, more than 3 million soldiers stood outside the home islands. In China, Manchuria, Korea, Indochina, the Philippines, Burma, and on hundreds of scattered Pacific islands. Many had not even heard the emperor's voice. Others had heard rumors, fragments of messages, distorted transmissions. Some believed the surrender was temporary. Some believed it was a trap. In Manchuria, events moved with terrifying speed. On August 8th, just 1 week before the emperor's broadcast, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion. The Red Army smashed through the Kwantung Army, once considered Japan's elite force. Entire divisions were overwhelmed in days.
Tanks rolled across plains Japanese commanders had assumed were secure. Communication lines collapsed. Officers burned codes and maps as they retreated. When surrender came, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers in Manchuria were already surrounded. But surrender to Soviet forces did not mean immediate repatriation. It meant captivity, and for many, years of it. Soviet authorities transported hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops to labor camps across Siberia. They were put to work in mines, logging camps, and construction projects in brutal climates. Winters plunged far below freezing. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. For men who had been told they would die gloriously in battle, the reality was something entirely different: survival through exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty. In China, Japanese forces had been fighting for 8 years. When surrender orders finally reached them, Chinese nationalist and communist forces rushed to disarm Japanese units. In some regions, Japanese troops were temporarily ordered to maintain order until Chinese forces could take control. The irony was staggering. Former occupiers suddenly tasked with preserving stability under the authority of their enemies. On Pacific Islands, isolation created its own chaos. Garrisons on remote islands like Truk, Rabaul, and countless smaller outposts often had limited radio contact. Some commanders received confirmation of surrender only after Allied ships appeared offshore. Leaflets were dropped from planes, announcing that the emperor had ended the war. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese, urging compliance. Many soldiers wept when they saw the leaflets bearing imperial seals. Others refused to believe them. There were cases of small units continuing to hide in jungles, convinced the war was ongoing. Some feared that surrender was a trick designed to lure them into the open. Propaganda had long warned them that Americans would torture prisoners or execute them immediately. The idea of stepping forward felt suicidal. In the Philippines, American forces encountered Japanese troops who emerged cautiously, white flags raised, eyes fixed on the ground. The ritual of surrender was deeply humiliating. Officers handed over their swords, symbols of authority and honor. Some did so with trembling hands. The sword was not merely a weapon. For many officers, it represented their lineage, their duty, their identity as warriors. To surrender it was to surrender the self. In Southeast Asia, British forces oversaw the disarmament of large Japanese formations. Soldiers stacked rifles in enormous piles. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces were catalogued and confiscated. Entire armies dissolved into waiting columns of defeated men. And yet, not all complied peacefully. There were violent incidents. In some areas, Japanese soldiers clashed with local populations seeking revenge after years of occupation. In others, small groups chose suicide over capture. Grenades were detonated in bunkers. Shots rang out in the night. But these were exceptions. The overwhelming reality was exhaustion. By mid-1945, Japan's military machine was starving. Supply lines had collapsed under relentless bombing and naval blockades. Soldiers were malnourished, uniforms tattered, ammunition scarce. Many had not been paid in months. The empire that once stretched triumphantly across Asia had been reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. Now those pockets were dissolving. Repatriation became one of the largest logistical operations in modern history. Ships were organized to transport millions of soldiers and civilians back to the Japanese home islands. The process took years. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 6 million people were returned to Japan from former imperial territories. For many soldiers, the journey home was long and uncertain. They boarded overcrowded vessels, unsure what awaited them. Rumors spread. that Japan had been destroyed entirely, that cities no longer existed, that famine was widespread. When they finally saw the coastline of their homeland, the reality was shocking. Tokyo had been firebombed into ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been devastated by atomic bombs. Industrial centers lay in ruins. Infrastructure was crippled. Families had been displaced. Some soldiers returned to their homes gone, their parents dead, their neighborhoods unrecognizable. The empire they had fought for no longer existed. Even more destabilizing was the Arakan occupation. For the first time in history, foreign troops stood on Japanese soil as rulers, not invaders in battle, but administrators of peace. Under General MacArthur, sweeping reforms began almost immediately. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were formally dissolved. Weapons were destroyed. Military institutions were dismantled. Officers who commanded divisions now stood in lines for food rations. The psychological shift was immense. These were men who had been taught they were defenders of a divine empire. Now they were unemployed veterans in a defeated nation under foreign supervision. And yet something unexpected occurred. Despite years of propaganda warning that Americans were barbaric and cruel, many returning soldiers encountered occupation troops who were disciplined and restrained. There were no mass executions. There were no widespread reprisals against ordinary soldiers. War crimes investigations targeted specific individuals, not the rank and file. For some veterans, this shattered yet another belief they had carried through the war. The enemy they had been taught to fear did not behave as expected. Still, uncertainty lingered everywhere. Former soldiers worried about prosecution. They worried about how civilians would view them. In a society facing food shortages and economic collapse, veterans were not always welcomed as heroes. Many blended quietly back into civilian life, avoiding discussion of their experiences. Some never spoke of the war again. The disintegration of Japan's empire was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling across continents. From Siberian labor camps to jungle clearings in the Philippines, from Chinese plains to ruined Tokyo streets, Japanese soldiers faced a reality they had never imagined: survival after total defeat. They had been trained to die for the empire. Instead, they were forced to live without it.
When the fighting stopped, the reckoning began. For many Japanese soldiers, surrender did not mean going home. It meant interrogation rooms, barbed wire, and the long shadow of accountability. Across Asia and the Pacific, Allied powers began sorting through millions of captives, separating ordinary conscripts from officers, intelligence personnel, and those suspected of atrocities. The scale was enormous. Japanese forces had occupied vast territories for years. In China alone, the war had lasted since 1937. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, prisoners of war, forced laborers, and civilian populations carried deep scars. Now, with Japan defeated, there was a demand for justice. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in 1946. Often compared to the Nuremberg trials in Europe, it targeted Japan's top political and military leaders. Former prime ministers, generals, and admirals faced charges ranging from waging aggressive war to crimes against humanity. Courtrooms filled with translators, prosecutors, defense teams, and mountains of documents. For the first time, senior architects of Japan's war strategy were publicly confronted with evidence of what had happened under their command. 7 high-ranking leaders were eventually sentenced to death and executed in 1948. Others received life imprisonment. Beyond Tokyo, hundreds of smaller war crimes trials took place across Asia, in Manila, Singapore, Hong Kong, Nanjing, and other cities.
These proceedings targeted officers and enlisted men accused of specific acts: mistreatment of prisoners, massacres, forced labor abuses. The outcomes varied. Some were acquitted, some received prison terms, some were executed. For ordinary soldiers sitting behind barbed wire, the fear was constant. Many did not know what they were being accused of or whether they would ever see home again. Rumors spread quickly in prison compounds. A name called out for questioning could mean release or a death sentence. Conditions in captivity depended heavily on where a soldier had surrendered. In American-run camps, especially within Japan itself after the occupation began, treatment generally followed the Geneva Conventions. Food was basic but sufficient. Prisoners performed labor but were not systematically brutalized. Many were eventually processed and released within months. But in Soviet custody, the experience was often far harsher. After the Red Army's invasion of Manchuria, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were transported to labor camps across Siberia and Central Asia. The journey itself could take weeks in overcrowded trains. Upon arrival, prisoners faced freezing temperatures, thin clothing, and grueling work assignments in mines, logging camps, and construction sites. Winters were merciless. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Disease spread through cramped barracks. Thousands died in captivity. For some, release did not come until the early 1950s, years after the war had officially ended. These men returned to Japan gaunt, traumatized, and often silent about what they had endured. In China, Japanese prisoners found themselves caught in a different kind of political transformation. The Chinese Civil War resumed between nationalist and communist forces. Some Japanese soldiers were used for labor. Others were subjected to re-education programs where they were encouraged to reflect on Japan's wartime actions and adopt new political views. A number were held for extended periods before repatriation. Meanwhile, within Japan, a profound shift was underway. Under Allied occupation, the military was dismantled entirely. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy ceased to exist. Weapons factories were shut down or converted to civilian production. Military leaders were purged from public office. A new constitution, enacted in 1947, renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation. Article 9 declared that Japan would never again maintain armed forces for the purpose of warfare. For career officers, this was an existential blow. Their profession, their identity, their hierarchy erased. Some former soldiers struggled to find work. Others blended quietly into civilian life, taking jobs as laborers, clerks, teachers, or farmers. In a country facing food shortages and economic collapse, survival became the immediate priority. Public discussion of wartime responsibility was complex and often uncomfortable. Many families preferred silence. Veterans rarely spoke in detail about what they had seen or done. There was also a moral reckoning unfolding within individual minds. Japanese soldiers had been taught that they were liberating Asia from Western colonialism, that their emperor was divine, that their cause was righteous. Confronted with evidence presented at trials, photographs, testimonies, documents, some struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality. Others rejected the legitimacy of the trials altogether, viewing them as victors' justice. The psychological burden varied. A conscript who had spent the war digging trenches might feel little personal guilt. An officer who had overseen brutal prison camps faced a different internal landscape. Yet even those not directly involved in crimes carried the weight of total defeat and the collapse of a worldview. And still, amid trials and imprisonment, the vast majority of Japan's millions of soldiers were eventually allowed to return home. By the early 1950s, most surviving prisoners had been repatriated. They stepped off ships into a nation transformed, cities rebuilding, American cultural influence spreading, a new democratic government taking shape. The empire was gone. Korea and Taiwan were no longer Japanese territories. Manchuria was lost. The Pacific Islands were under foreign control. The men who had once worn imperial uniforms now wore civilian clothes in a country that officially renounced the very institution they had served. For some, there was relief. The nightmare of war and captivity was over. For others, there was bitterness over defeat, over imprisonment, over leaders who had led them into catastrophe. And for many, there was simply exhaustion. Justice, punishment, forgiveness, denial, all of these coexisted in the uneasy aftermath. The war had ended with a broadcast. The empire had collapsed in weeks. But the consequences for Japanese soldiers unfolded over years, in courtrooms, in prison camps, in quiet kitchens where veterans avoided their children's questions. They had survived battle. Now they had to survive memory.
When the ships finally brought them home, many Japanese soldiers did not recognize their own country. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 6 million servicemen and civilians were repatriated from former imperial territories. They arrived in waves from China, Korea, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, and Soviet labor camps. Some stepped onto docks in Hiroshima and saw a city flattened by a single bomb. Others returned to Tokyo and found entire districts reduced to blackened foundations from firebombing raids. The home they had imagined during lonely nights at the front no longer existed. Rail stations were overcrowded with displaced families. Food shortages were severe. Inflation was spiraling. Black markets thrived in alleyways where people traded anything, clothing, heirlooms, tools, for rice. Former soldiers, still thin from years of combat or captivity, stood in ration lines alongside civilians who had endured air raids and hunger. There were no parades. There were no victory speeches. Instead of honor, many veterans felt something closer to embarrassment. The ideology that had defined their service, sacrifice for a divine empire, had collapsed. The emperor remained on the throne, but he publicly renounced his divinity in 1946. For soldiers raised to believe they served a living God, this announcement was quietly seismic. The entire moral structure that had justified years of hardship was dissolving. Under the Allied occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur, sweeping reforms reshaped Japan. The military was abolished. The new constitution renounced war. Land reforms weakened traditional elites. Women gained the right to vote. Education was rewritten to remove militarist ideology. For returning officers, the transformation was disorienting. Men who had once commanded thousands now searched for ordinary employment. Their uniforms were gone. Their swords had been surrendered. Rank carried no authority in civilian life. Some adapted quickly, grateful simply to be alive. Others struggled. Psychological trauma was rarely discussed openly. There was no widespread system of veteran counseling. Many former soldiers internalized their experiences. Nightmares, survivor's guilt, and suppressed memories became private burdens. In a society focused on rebuilding, there was little space for public mourning of imperial ambitions. Families, too, had changed. Children who had grown up during the war often barely remembered their fathers. Wives had managed households alone under bombardment and scarcity. Reunions were sometimes joyful, sometimes strained. Years of separation could not be erased overnight. For soldiers returning from Soviet captivity, reintegration was even more complicated. Some had been absent for 5 or 6 years after the surrender.
Rumors and suspicion surrounded them. A few were questioned about possible ideological influence from communist re-education programs. Most simply tried to re-enter society quietly, avoiding attention. In rural areas, former soldiers returned to farming villages that had lost young men in staggering numbers. Memorial tablets in local shrines bore the names of those who never came back. Survivors carried a silent awareness that they had outlived friends who had died in jungles, on beaches, or in prison camps. And yet, amid the devastation, something unexpected was taking root. Japan began to rebuild at remarkable speed. Factories reopened, infrastructure was repaired. By the early 1950s, economic growth was accelerating. American aid and access to global markets helped fuel recovery. A new generation raised after the war grew up with different priorities: education, stability, economic opportunity. For many veterans, this transformation was bittersweet. They had fought for an empire that no longer existed. The country rising around them was peaceful, democratic, and increasingly prosperous, but fundamentally different from the one they had sworn to defend. Public memory of the war became complicated. Official narratives often emphasized Japan's suffering, the atomic bombings, the firebombing of cities, the hardship of occupation. Discussions of Japanese military aggression abroad were more fragmented and sometimes avoided in everyday conversation. Veterans themselves were divided. Some felt remorse, some felt resentment, many felt both. Silence became common. In homes across the country, fathers rarely told detailed stories about what they had seen in China, the Philippines, or Burma. Children sensed there were chapters of family history left unspoken. The psychological distance between pre-war militarism and post-war pacifism created a generational gap. Yet survival itself carried a quiet dignity. These men had endured indoctrination, brutal combat, starvation, captivity, defeat, and national collapse. Now they were helping rebuild roads, start businesses, teach in schools, and raise families in a nation that had renounced the path that sent them to war. The transformation was not instantaneous. Poverty persisted into the late 1940s. Black markets remained active. Housing shortages were severe. But gradually, stability returned. In 1952, the Allied occupation formally ended. Japan regained sovereignty. By then, most former soldiers had settled into civilian roles. Some would later become part of the newly formed self-defense forces, established under a different philosophy, defensive rather than imperial. For many veterans, however, the most difficult adjustment was internal. They had once believed death in battle was the highest honor. Instead, they were living ordinary lives, commuting to work, attending school ceremonies, shopping in markets. The extraordinary intensity of wartime existence gave way to routine. Some found comfort in that normalcy. Others felt a lingering emptiness, as if a defining chapter of their identity had been erased without replacement. The empire was gone. The uniforms were folded away. The swords were surrendered. The ideology had been rewritten. But the memories remained. Quiet, persistent, often unspoken. Japan was rebuilding itself into something new, and the men who had once marched under imperial banners now walked anonymously through its recovering streets, carrying the long, complicated shadow of a war that had reshaped their nation and themselves forever.
Even after the surrender, the war did not end for everyone. In remote jungles and on isolated islands, small groups of Japanese soldiers remained hidden, some for months, some for years, and a few for decades. Cut off from reliable communication, trained to distrust enemy propaganda, and bound by a code that equated surrender with disgrace, they continued to live as if the empire still existed.
Leaflets were dropped from airplanes. Loudspeakers broadcast messages announcing that Japan had surrendered. Families were brought to the islands to call out the names of sons and brothers hiding in the hills. Yet for certain holdouts, every message looked like a trick. They had been taught that Americans would use deception. They had been told that capture meant torture. The emperor's voice in 1945 had already shattered their world once. Trusting another announcement felt impossible. On islands in the Philippines, small bands of soldiers survived by raiding farms at night, repairing old weapons, and patching uniforms with jungle fibers. They avoided contact, studied passing aircraft, and interpreted every distant explosion as proof that the war still raged somewhere beyond the horizon. One of the most famous cases was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who remained hidden in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended. He refused to surrender until his former commanding officer personally traveled to the island and formally relieved him of duty. When he finally emerged in full uniform, rifle still functional, it stunned the world. But Onoda was not entirely alone. Other holdouts were discovered in the late 1940s and 1950s, some emerging thin and disoriented, others dying in skirmishes long after peace treaties had been signed. These men represented something more than isolation. They embodied the final echo of Imperial Japan, a refusal to accept that the world had changed. Back on the home islands, Japan was transforming rapidly. The devastation of 1945 gave way to what would later be called the economic miracle. Factories modernized, technology industries expanded, cities rose from ashes into dense landscapes of concrete, steel, and neon. By the 1960s, Japan was becoming one of the world's fastest-growing economies. The contrast was stark. Men who had once fought in hand-to-hand jungle combat now worked in offices assembling electronics. Former artillery operators supervised factory lines. Veterans who had marched across Asia now rode commuter trains through Tokyo's expanding suburbs. In 1954, Japan established the Self-Defense Forces, a military in structure but officially defensive in purpose. The Constitution's Article 9 still renounced war. The new force was framed not as an imperial army, but as a shield for national protection. For some veterans, this was a necessary evolution. For others, it felt like a reminder of a past they could not fully reconcile. Public memory of the war grew increasingly complex. War memorials honored the dead, but debates emerged about responsibility and interpretation. School textbooks evolved. Political leaders navigated sensitive diplomatic relationships with countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation. Within families, conversations about wartime actions often remained cautious. Many veterans chose silence. Some believed they had simply followed orders in extraordinary times. Some carried regret. Others felt anger at leaders who had promised victory and delivered catastrophe. A few held on to nationalist pride, convinced that Japan had fought for survival against overwhelming odds. There was no single narrative. By the 1970s and 1980s, Japan had become an economic superpower. Skyscrapers rose where bombed-out districts once stood. Bullet trains sped across landscapes that once echoed with air raid sirens. Younger generations grew up in prosperity with little direct memory of wartime hardship. For them, the war was history. For the soldiers who had lived it, it was memory, vivid, heavy, sometimes unresolved. When the last known holdouts finally surrendered or passed away, it marked more than the end of individual stories. It symbolized the closing of a chapter that had begun with expansion, sacrifice, and absolute certainty, and ended with surrender, occupation, and reinvention. The Japanese soldiers of World War II did not vanish after 1945. They became fathers, factory workers, teachers, politicians, quiet retirees. They carried scars that were not always visible. They adapted to a nation that had renounced the very ideology that had shaped their youth. Some saw the post-war transformation as redemption, proof that Japan could rebuild without conquest. Others saw it as loss, the disappearance of a world they once believed eternal. But history moved forward. The empire dissolved, the uniforms faded, the swords rusted or were displayed in museums. The emperor remained, but no longer divine. The country they had fought for reinvented itself as a peaceful industrial democracy. In the end, what happened to Japanese soldiers after World War II was not a single outcome, but millions of individual journeys. From jungle holdouts to Siberian prisoners, from war crimes defendants to anonymous office workers, their paths diverged. Yet all were shaped by that moment in August 1945, when a voice on the radio told them to endure the unendurable. They had been prepared to die for an empire. Instead, they lived to see it transformed, and in doing so, became witnesses to one of the most dramatic national reinventions in modern history.